Good afternoon. I'm TJ Poor. I'm the Director of Regulated Utility Planning at the Public Service Department, and welcome to the third installment in the Public Service Department's informational webinar series. Series is intended to ground attendees in basic information on Vermont's electricity sources and our policy. Today's topic is renewable energy certificates. This is part of a broader review of the current state of electricity policies and programs, as was recommended by the state's comprehensive energy plan, and then later followed up by the climate action plan. The first set of webinars that we did covered the topic of where Vermont's electricity comes from, and the second set of webinars went into a little more detail about the current renewable electricity programs and policies in the state, including the Renewable Energy Standard, the Net Metering Program, and the Standard Offer Program. You can find videos of the first two webinars if you weren't able to attend on our website at publicservice.vermont.gov/renewables. At each of those first two sets of webinars, we touched on the concept of renewable energy certificates and how they're used to measure Vermont's electricity portfolio and its greenhouse gas emissions from the electric sector. By far, renewable energy certificates or renewable energy credits generated the most questions and follow-ups, which is why we've devoted this third webinar to providing more information here. We're really pleased to have with us Jason Gifford of Sustainable Energy Advantage to dive into the details. But before really introducing Jason and diving in, I want to cover some webinar logistics. If we could go to the next slide, please. So first, please remain muted with your video off throughout the webinar. And please use the chat box for questions and direct those questions in the chat to Claire McElveny. The chat is our primary means of having questions and answers. The webinar is structured so that only the Public Service Department staff can see your questions, and we will facilitate that discussion. We set it up this way because we received substantial feedback after the first set of webinars that the chat was really distracting to the general public, and we adjusted accordingly for the second set of webinars. For those second set of webinars, there was a minority of commenters that didn't like the change, but the weight of the feedback was positive, and we're carrying forward that practice today. Again, questions, if you hit the chat button at the bottom of your screen, please direct them to Claire McElveny of the Public Service Department. If the chat isn't a good option for you, you can raise your hand during the Q&A period. We'll do our best to answer the questions that are relevant to renewable energy certificates in this broader conversation. Questions that we're not able to get to may be addressed in some follow-up communications, probably through the service list and posted to our website. I'll note that closed captioning is available for today's webinar by clicking the appropriate button on Zoom, as shown on the right side of the toolbar. The closed captions are auto-generated, so they might not be 100% accurate, but they can be helpful. And then finally, this webinar, like the first sessions, is being recorded and will be posted on the department's website. So, consistent with those initial webinars, we really want to understand a little bit about you. So a short poll will be popping up on your screen momentarily. Answering these questions is voluntary and all responses will be anonymous. We'll use the data collected to help inform our outreach efforts going forward and to help us be transparent about who was here, who we heard from, who we didn't hear from, and to offer context for our recommendations. Please take a second to answer these questions if you want to. There's more than one question, so before you hit submit, please scroll down so you can respond to all the questions. And I'll just pause here and give folks a minute to respond. Okay, so thank you for doing that, and thank you for attending today. It's very much appreciated. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Jason Gifford. Jason has well over 2 decades of experience in the development of renewable energy policy, market analysis, and financial modeling. As a senior director at Sustainable Energy Advantage, Jason provides objective analysis for a wide range of public and private sector renewable and energy market participants. Since 2005, Jason's co-managed the Sustainable Energy Advantage's Renewable Energy Market Outlook Service, which provides a detailed assessment of renewable energy credit supply, demand, and price dynamics across New England. Really, Jason brings a clear-eyed, objective view of the region's use of renewable energy certificates, and we're pleased to have him today to help provide a foundation for our review of renewable and clean electricity policy in Vermont. Jason has a BA from Bates College, an MBA from Babson, and is one of Vermont's own. He lives in Richmond. So with that, I will turn it directly over to you, Jason. Thanks.
TJ, thanks very much. Thanks everyone for attending today as well. I really appreciate your time, and I appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation. I look forward very much to the Q&A. Before getting there, I think I'm just going to jump right in. Let's go. And do a little table setting. For me, this is a little like painting your house. If you don't get the prep right, it's not going to stick. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes laying out some structure that I hope will be very helpful to our conversation. So overall, what the purpose of this conversation, as I see it, is to discuss how energy portfolio characteristics are substantiated and verified. We want to be able to explain things clearly. So what we're going to talk about today is what we are trying to accomplish, and then within that, what role RECs play. And then we'll get into some of the mechanics of what is a REC and how does it work, and regional and national market, and then wrap up with implications for Vermont. We are not going to today get into discussion about RES or renewable energy policy design in general, or RES targets in particular. These are fascinating and important conversations that I would love to be a part of, but are not the subject of our focus today. So what are we trying to accomplish? Few things initially. One is to verify compliance with public policy mandates, so the Renewable Energy Standard, and progress towards public policy objectives more generally, whether they be related to renewables or zero carbon or other. And then secondarily, to substantiate corporate, institutional, or other voluntary participation in renewable energy markets. Either way, we need to be able to clearly substantiate and verify each party's energy portfolio. Okay, so how do we go about accomplishing these goals? What we're trying to do is reliably describe, count, and then allocate the attributes. In other words, the descriptive characteristics of every megawatt hour on the system. So a few things are going to be recurring themes in my remarks here, and that one of them is that this theory of certificates applies to renewables and to non-renewables. In fact, to every megawatt hour on the system. And my hope is that if we think about it in this holistic way, that will help when we narrow in on the renewable energy discussion, on the REC discussion. So if we think about the context in which many of us are coming at this, energy and attributes are created together, and they can be sold together or they can be sold separately. So those are our primary options, right? So bundled as terminology, I mean purchasing energy and attributes together. And this is what most of us are familiar with historically. And we might even just refer to this as a contract, right? When we think of a contract, we're picturing a generator, and we're sort of involuntarily just associating all of the attributes of that generator with the energy we're purchasing. But we can also purchase energy and attributes separately. So these are unbundled transactions. But in every case, they come back together at the end of the day on a one-to-one basis. And so I'll refer to this one-to-one game of musical chairs because I hope that it's an effective metaphor and helps you picture both at the outset and then at the conclusion, everything is going to line up one-to-one. And again, it's going to include both renewables and non-renewables. All right, so naming conventions. I've already used some synonyms, and so I wanted to take a minute to lay out what I mean with these terminology here. Renewable energy certificate. Okay, so certificate is the word that is used in the NEPL Generation Information System. So the GIS I'll refer to throughout. Renewable energy credit is the more common vernacular. Either way, it's a REC. It's intended to mean the same thing. And it's intended to be used to describe and verify energy characteristics. So further to the definition, a REC or a certificate is tradable, and it represents 1 megawatt hour, always 1 megawatt hour, from a specified electric generator. And it has descriptive characteristics associated with it: fuel type, location, and actual emissions. So for example, a wind generator located in Lowell, Vermont, and which of course would have actual emissions profile of always 0. In addition, within the NEPL GIS system, every megawatt hour has literally a checkbox as to whether or not it satisfies the eligibility criteria of state by state and class by class or tier by tier renewable energy policies. You can only use it once, but you can see what public policies it is eligible or more accurately certified, I should say, to serve. And what it does is the REC affords the buyer, whoever ultimately holds the REC at the end of the day, the unique claim to those descriptive characteristics. So one more point as it relates to emissions, for example. RECs don't inherently include any secondary impacts or benefits. So this would be emissions displaced, as an example. You could include or append those specifically, try to purchase that kind of benefit, but the certificate on its own is meant to factually describe the megawatt hour with which it's associated. All right, so how do RECs work? How are they transacted? This is intended to be mechanical, because at the end of the day, the certificate is it is a tool. It is a mechanism to verify a portfolio and its associated compliance. So you start with a bilateral negotiation, 2 entities agreeing on price and volume from a buyer to a seller. Once that is in place, then you can go to this central clearinghouse, the NEPL Generation Information System, to effectuate that transfer from the buyer to the seller. And each utility, in Vermont's case, but there are other forms of load serving entities in other states, has an account. And at the end of the trading year, all of their energy and all of their certificates must line up 1-to-1. And here, again, similar concept, but expressed in a slightly different way. You can choose to purchase those together, or you can choose to purchase them separately. You always end up 1-to-1. So an active approach to managing this might be purchasing the attributes that you want associated with your load. Again, you could purchase them with energy, bundled or unbundled. But if you don't purchase for 100% certificates for 100% of your load, or if you don't purchase for any amount of your load, you get the certificates that are left over. So in the game of musical chairs, you sit on the one chair that's left. In purchasing your certificates, you can choose from all of the available characteristics: renewable, non-renewable, nuclear, fossil, hydro, other. But if you don't choose, what's left is a residual mix. So it takes into account all of the certificates that have been purchased proactively. It looks at what's left, and then it allocates those to all entities that don't have 100% of their certificates. Again, at the end of the year, the accounting that matters is when the dust settles, if you will, and at the end of a trading year, what certificates does a Vermont utility or any other load serving entity retain and retire? You can imagine even in energy markets, volumes of energy are traded from among many different entities throughout the year, but we don't step in and look at long positions or short positions in the interim. What we look at is when the trading concludes, what energy is assigned to what entity. And in this instance, we're talking about what attributes are assigned to what entity. So retirement just refers to that permanent retention of the certificate, if you will. Importantly, if you enter those more traditional bundled contracts, you still need to go through these steps at the NEPL GIS. Certificates still need to be transferred from a buyer, from a seller to a buyer. There is, as with many things in energy policy, more nuance. I have, in that light gray text at the bottom, a reference to banking, which is another flexibility mechanism, which means you can buy more than you need in 1 year and use it for compliance toward the next. I think I would like to maybe come back to that during the Q&A session so that we can focus on I can stay on time more or less and focus on some of the core principles here. So looking at regional and national markets, again, what is the primary focus and how do these markets function? So we're looking at, again, certificate purchase either for RPS compliance or to support voluntary claims. So in the RPS or RES context, eligibility criteria vary by state. So there will be varying demands for different types of certificates, and the pricing is going to reflect that. In the near term, certificate prices are based on supply and demand balance. In the longer term, this is also true, but it also can be a function of what is the cost of the new market entrant that you need to fulfill that demand. And that's particularly for tiers or classes of within these policies that require more and more energy, growth tiers. So in our context, let's say Vermont Tier 2 increases over time and requires the development of new renewable energy generators, less than 5 megawatts, interconnected to the Vermont distribution system. In any case, when we're looking at the policy markets, the RES or RPS markets, they're in all instances subject to alternative compliance payments. So this puts a price cap effectively on the market. So just an important dynamic to keep in mind if you're interested in REC pricing is that if you can, in the alternative, comply with a fixed payment, there's really no instance in which you would expect the market price of certificates to exceed that alternative compliance mechanism. For those of you thinking more broadly than regionally, I want to note that RECs need to either originate within ISO New England or be delivered into ISO New England with their corresponding energy and to a particular counterparty. So these transactions are unit specific, and you need to move both the energy and the RECs into New England and to a particular counterparty in order to effectuate the creation of a certificate in the NEPL GIS that you could use for compliance. With respect to voluntary claims, the market's a little broader. Buyers can define what criteria they're interested in based on their own preferences, whether they're trying to have a zero emissions portfolio, whether trying to be 100% renewable or something else. Pricing in the voluntary market is all based on willingness to pay. And there aren't the same limitations on geographic boundaries, which definitely makes the conversation about voluntary markets slightly more complicated. And I'd be happy to answer questions about that if you have them. So lastly, I want to wrap up my initial remarks with some comments about the implications or context for Vermont. So again, what we're trying to accomplish is demonstrating compliance with the RES, and doing that either through attributes, through RECs, or through alternative compliance payments. RES obligated entities can choose to purchase energy and NEPL GIS certificates, so the RECs, either together or separately. And when generation is owned, so this is a uniquely Vermont phenomenon within New England. When generation is owned, utilities can most certainly elect to retain those RECs, or they can elect to sell the RECs to other parties. So this is going to be a function of supply and demand and the eligibility of certificates for various policies around the region. So this ties back to the comment I made earlier about the accounting that matters in particular is what attributes the utilities elect to retain and retire at the end of the year. Those RECs, those attributes are the ones that are associated with serving the retail load in Vermont. Again, certificates associated with all transactions, whether they're bundled or unbundled, settle in the NEPL GIS. And NEPL GIS certificates are above all intended as a flexibility mechanism, one that we hope would increase liquidity, but at the same time reduce transaction costs and ensure that attributes are never double counted. So I think now I'd love to take questions if there are any. Happy to return to comments that I introduced in my remarks or anything else.
Thanks, Jason. So we have a couple questions lined up already. So one says a couple different parts, but I think it ties together some of what you've been talking about nicely. So can trading in RECs lead to double counting of renewable energy production? For example, if a utility owns a solar array that produces 10 megawatt hours that is fed into the grid, as I understand it, there would also be 10 RECs for that production. Can the utility trade those RECs to another utility, which then claims those 10 megawatt hours of renewable energy, or retire the RECs and claim another 10 megawatt hours for itself? What is built into the system that precludes this from happening?
Okay, yes, this is a multi-dimensional question, but it's an excellent one because it does get right to the heart of one of the things I'm trying to convey. So I'm going to key in on one of the you asked if they can retire the RECs and claim another 10 megawatt hours for itself. And I guess the key to understanding this is it's not another 10 megawatt hours. So when, in this example, when the solar array produces 10 megawatt hours, you have 10 and only 10 megawatt hours of attributes. And I think when you ask this question, if you are thinking of solar energy as the 10 megawatt hours, you are defaulting to a bundled contract. And that's completely fine. We just need to label it as such. You are assuming that the energy and the REC remain together. It is just possible now in the modern energy market to sell the REC independently of the energy. But when you do, maybe the part I should have been more explicit about is that other attributes then fill in that space. So if a utility in Vermont owns the solar plant you described, they generate 10 megawatt hours. If they sell 10 RECs to another entity in Vermont or an entity out of state, then they must, either because they've purchased other certificates or they've been assigned, they take on 10 megawatt hours worth of other attributes. So there is a conservation of attributes in that one-to-one game of musical chairs. Sorry for the long response, but it was a good question.
No, that's great. And I think a follow-up question that came in, just to stay with this one, is if you could speak to how unbundling impacts emissions, so whether it helps or doesn't help reduce emissions overall.
Right. Fundamentally, it doesn't, unbundling certificates doesn't directly impact emissions. The impact on emissions is more through the policy design and the market and the way the market develops to construct and operate generators to meet load. So over time, in the earliest days of renewables, when New England renewables were comprised of 6 megawatts in Reedsboro, we were just trying to grow the market, and so we were trying to be flexible and encouraging new generators onto the system. Now policies are evolving more toward, well, if we're going to try to get to 80, 90, 100%, we need to think about hourly and 24/7, and we need to think about peaks. And so those are the elements of the policy that are going to impact marginal emissions and the emissions in general, and RECs, whether unbundled or not, are really just that mechanism to capture what's generated and when.
Great, thanks, Jason. And then just one follow-up while we're on the emissions piece. If you could speak to what determines which facilities receive RECs specifically, and whether or not that is related to the emissions they produce, that would be helpful.
Okay, yeah. So every single facility in New England receives a certificate for every single megawatt hour produced. We just talk about the renewable ones, and then we refer to them as RECs, but it's not a different commodity. It's the same NEPL GIS certificate. It's the same certificate that a nuclear facility receives, for example, or a natural gas. It's 1 megawatt hour, and it describes the characteristics. We've named RECs, and RECs have come to the forefront because they attract more, there's more of a market for them because we have policy mandates like the res, and that's the compliance mechanism. So the entities in the market have a mandate to purchase them if they're going to comply with the state policies. Whereas there is no mandate currently to purchase certificates from non-renewable. And so there are fewer transactions and less attention. I will say, however, that as the region trends towards thinking about 100% either renewable or clean, there is more attention being paid to it. Massachusetts, for example, has added clean energy related requirements to its policy that are actively right now creating a market for large hydro certificates in particular, and nuclear certificates. So as we think about achieving greenhouse gas goals and zero carbon objectives, in addition to renewables, we will see more transacting among those other certificates.
Right, took a moment to find my unmute button. That's really helpful, Jason. So pivoting a little bit, I think this question is specifically about slide 6. If you want to quickly go back. And the question is, it would be helpful if you could walk through an example, and specifically for Vermont, if possible, I think just to contextualize some of what you're talking about.
Absolutely. And Claire, is it generally an example from the slide, or is there anything more in particular about?
No, I think just generally speaking, there wasn't anything more.
Okay. Yeah, certainly. And thank you for asking the question. I'm trying to balance, the right level of detail in my initial remarks. So happy to have the opportunity to answer the questions you're most interested in. So let's create an example of a utility in Vermont. We'll keep it local, who intends to comply with the renewable energy standard. And it's actually easiest. Let's first assume that there's no owned generation. They don't have their own portfolio. So they have identified the owner of an asset. Let's just say it's a wind asset, and then negotiate a volume of megawatt hours over the course of the year, and a price for those megawatt hours. They're going to enter a bundled contract. They're going to purchase the energy and the attributes together from that generator. So that occurs, and then in the NEPOOL GIS system, there's really just a mechanical process where you can actually automate. You can enter the terms of your agreement. You can say, every time a certificate is created from this facility up to this volume, please transfer it from the generator's account to this utility's account in Vermont. And then assuming that utility keeps that certificate and doesn't sell it to someone else, that would be retired, and it would be part of the description of their portfolio at the end of the year. Let's say that utility, just for round numbers, enters contracts like that and has this active transfer of certificates that amount to 50% of their load for the course of the year, and doesn't purchase any other certificates. In that event, because we always have to have a one-to-one match, the GIS system would then compile the residual mix, what's left over at the end of the year. And that's probably most, if not all, of the fossil generation, lots of nuclear generation, and that, you know, there's, I'm sure there's some hydro in there as well. And then that would be assigned to this hypothetical Vermont utility, and those certificates would constitute the other 50% of its portfolio at the end of the year. In a case where the utility owns a lot of generation itself, it would be a little different. The thought process you would go through is, here's the production from these facilities. So if they've produced, you know, 5,000 megawatt hours, you've got the 5,000 megawatt hours of associated RECs in your account, and you can elect whether to keep those or to sell them to someone else. If you sell them to someone else, you have to replace them. If you don't replace them, you get assigned residual certificates. So sorry for keeping, you know, but I want to just continue to reinforce that the one-to-one nature of this. And then I think looking over the slide for items that I may have missed, you know, if part of the question is what I've bolded here, and that the accounting that matters is what attributes the utility has at the end of the year. You know, in that example, it's just essentially you want to create a narrative of what were the steps. The utility owns generation in this other example, but and I suppose it's perfectly fine to factually describe what the utility owns, but then once those facilities operate, then it's a series of elective decisions. You can choose to retain the energy and attributes from that generation or not. And so let's come up with another hypothetical. Let's say McNeil operates throughout the year, creates energy and RECs one-to-one, and the energy, of course, serves much of the load in the Burlington Electric Department territory. And then you can choose to either retain the associated RECs if McNeil is the descriptive characteristic that you want associated with the energy, or you can sell those and replace those with something else. And the market does provide price signals that inform those decisions, right? If that McNeil REC is valuable in Connecticut, and the owner of that REC elects to sell the REC to someone who participates in the Connecticut market, then let's just say it's BED to keep it simple. Then BED would sell the REC, replace it with some other REC. Maybe they're keeping an eye on the emissions in their portfolio, so maybe it's replaced with a hydro REC. But that becomes that BED is then, that megawatt hour of load was served by hydro. There is no other way to describe it. And I think that's what I'm trying to get at with the attributes at the end of each applicable period.
Thanks, Jason. That's really helpful. I have a couple follow-up questions, I think, to some of that, but as just a quick clarifying question, we have one. Someone asking if you can just again cover what the attributes are that you're talking about that might be assigned to a REC or a certificate, more broadly speaking, perhaps.
Yes. So the attribute, I use attribute and certificate and REC as synonyms. So it is it is the factual description of the megawatt hour. So the attributes are, it was wind from Sheffield, and it had 0 emissions. It is not describing any kind of impact on the system. It's not talking about displacement. It is the actual descriptive characteristics of the facility and its actual emissions. So I think, and I want to let you get on to other follow-ups and questions, but what I'm hearing and what I'm trying to address is the sense that a REC is something extra. And it's not something extra. It just allows the attributes to be separated from the energy and sold separately. And once you do, the energy is null. It has no attribute at all. And I think that is the concept that we're struggling with, which I understand. But I guess what I would ask is we embrace this the same way that if I enter a contract with a Southern Vermont solar facility, and it's a traditional contract, the type we're all very comfortable with. It's energy and RECs. I haven't separated anything. What we've embraced, though, is that does not mean that the electrons from that facility are traveling to my toaster. Energy markets are financial transactions anyhow, and we've very much accepted that. And so in the last 20 years, what we have done is just extended that very same concept to the attributes. So I recognize that it can be awkward, especially if it's new, but the moment you separate the energy and the REC, the energy is null. It is not solar energy. It is not wind energy. It is not, we are served by McNeil, but we've sold the REC someplace else. It is temporarily null, but in my game of one-to-one musical chairs, that's why the end of the period is what matters, because the energy is whatever RECs you decide to retain or purchase.
Thanks, Jason. That's helpful. So a follow-up question there, I think, is if you could talk a little bit more about during what time periods or over what time periods RECs can be transferred, on sort of the granularity that they describe generation, whether it's, hourly or quarterly or just annual, and then when, if at all, RECs expire. For example, would they expire at the end of the year?
Okay, excellent question. RECs are created quarterly in the NEPL GIS. They call it minting. So every quarter, but on a lag in order to get all the metering correctly. Every quarter, RECs are created for that quarter's generation. RECs can be transferred within an annual trading period. So again, it's on a lag. So it's not January 1st to December 31st, but the RECs for that period can be traded within a trading year. So you can transfer annually, and at the end of the fourth quarter trading period for that applicable year, the music stops, and there's no more trading, and all of the RECs are retired at that point. And in a manner of speaking, they expire at that time. It just means you have to have done with them whatever you're going to do before the fourth trading period of the applicable year. This gets back to the what we casually refer to as banking that I referred to earlier. And it's critical to explain this precisely. So banking does not happen in the NEPL GIS. Those RECs are created quarterly, like I said, and can be traded up to annually at a maximum. Then that's it. If you would like to bank, so to speak, what you're actually doing is over complying at the state level in 1 year, and the state is allowing you to carry that compliance into the next year. So if in a given year, the Vermont mandate is 50% qualifying renewables, and I settle energy and RECs equal to 55% of my load, then the regulatory authority lets me carry that extra 5% of compliance into the next year. There's a limit on how much of that you can do, but that is how the carry forward works.
Great. I think that's really helpful. This next question actually also refers to a specific slide, so slide 7. You want to take a minute to navigate back.
Okay.
And the question is, if you could discuss the comment that energy and RECs delivered from generators that are outside of New England, that they need to be bundled. For example, so any energy generators outside of New England, whether or not those RECs need to be bundled with the energy purchase.
Right. Okay. So the end point that an importing generator is trying to accomplish is the creation of a NEPL GIS certificate. That's their commodity. If they can't get that minted for them, then they don't have something to sell. So in order to do that, they need to import the associated energy into ISO New England. So if I have a wind generator in New York or in Quebec, and I'm able to both operate and schedule energy over one of the ties, then I can bring RECs with the same amount of energy. So if I'm able to move 100 megawatt hours, I will have 100 megawatt hours of certificates created in NEPL GIS that equals the energy I brought in, and I have to have a particular counterparty in New England to make that transaction work. That counterparty, once it has purchased the energy and RECs that have been imported, could then theoretically, do more transactions, just like anyone who owns energy and RECs within New England. But that's how that transaction needs to occur to create RECs in New England.
Great. And I think the second part of this question with some additional follow-up, which TJ, we may need to call on you to help provide some context as well, is if you could talk about how this relates to Hydro-Quebec and the attestations in Vermont under the Renewable Energy Standard, and for example, why this presentation is not discussing the Hydro-Quebec attributes and why they aren't traded. So how we deal with Hydro-Quebec attributes in particular, and how they show up in the NEPL GIS system.
So, Jason, maybe it would be good if you started with how those show up in the NEPL GIS as an import, and then I can field the res related portion of it.
Yes. Certainly. So the energy is imported from Quebec into New England, and it is imported as the Quebec system mix net of any specific transactions that are occurring on the Quebec side. So if HQ owns wind facilities or solar and are claiming those attributes themselves, all of that is removed. So there's no chance of double counting. And then they're exporting their system, the remaining system mix, which is nearly 100% hydro, but not precisely 100%. So the certificate that the Renewable GIS creates mimics what Hydro-Quebec has imported. And now I'll hand it to you, TJ. I mean, Vermont then just allows its utilities to recognize the hydro portion of that, which is not 100%, but nearly so.
Yeah, that's right. So Vermont, by statute, allows the imported large hydro to account for tier 1 of the renewable energy standard. And the utilities must show an attestation by Hydro-Quebec as to the percentage of that system mix that is renewable. And their attestations are over 99% renewable. I think the other point to make here on how that shows up in the system, well, first, Vermont has long, for decades, had contracts with Hydro-Quebec that included their bundled contracts. So the energy and the attributes are together as they're delivered into New England. And how that shows up in the portfolio, and as it relates to how Jason was describing the one-to-one relationship of kind of the musical chairs, is that if McNeil, the biomass generating station that was used as an example earlier, those utilities that own McNeil sell those attributes to a different utility, then they replace them with another attribute. And in Vermont, that attribute that they replace it with is often a Hydro-Quebec attribute. So the power has been delivered to Vermont, or to New England, I should say, often through the interface in Highgate in northern Vermont. And the attributes of that power are used to count in the portfolio at the end of the year. What is counted, they've sold off those biomass RECs or other renewable energy credits, and then replace them with, in large proportion, Hydro-Quebec renewable energy credits. So hopefully that got to both parts of the question there.
Great. Thanks, TJ, for jumping in on that one. I just want to acknowledge that we're almost at the top of the hour. We definitely have more questions than we can get to, and I just want to acknowledge that we have some really great questions being entered. So we are recording all of them. Think about, again, as we have in previous webinars, the best way to address them. But we'll try and get as many in the next 3 or so minutes as we can. I think I'm going to go back a little bit. Did I lose my question? We've been talking a lot about RECs in the context of utilities complying with a renewable energy or renewable portfolio standard. But if you could speak to this question, which focuses a little bit more on municipalities or individuals who might be trying to make decisions around ownership or financing a renewable project. If you could just talk a little bit more generally about what they might want to consider, in this context, whether to sell or retain, and how that might play out.
Sure. The part of the benefit of being able to transact RECs separately is that it can help in the financing of facilities, but I think it doesn't change the decision-making process once whether it's a municipality or an individual. If you want to claim that if you've installed solar and if you want to claim that you are powered by solar or that you are, that's serving that solar energy is serving your load, you need to retain the RECs. So there's a trade-off. If you want to monetize the revenue stream in order to finance the project, then you've sold the right to say you're powered by solar energy in my example. I'm trying to be brief but helpful.
Appreciate that. And so actually I think we'll end on this question, which is a follow-up to the Hydro-Quebec conversation you're having, just as clarifying, and maybe this is for either you or TJ, but if you could just clarify what the motivation for selling a REC might be for, in the example, McNeil, and then replacing it with a REC from another resource such as Hydro-Quebec, and I think the example that was given, whether that's policy or financing or something else.
Yeah, I can take the first shot at that one. And it really think it goes to the least cost planning requirements that our utilities have in the state. So they're required to provide service at least cost. And so when there is an opportunity to sell, for example, a biomass REC into another market that may value that particular resource highly and pay a premium for that, then utilities will want to sell those into that market in order to and replace with a renewable energy credit that is priced at less of a premium. And how those are priced are based on the supply and demand of those RECs and how they meet the renewable energy standard or portfolio requirements of each state. So each state places different priorities on different types of resources, and that creates different values for different resources. So a utility might sell one REC that is a higher value to somebody else and replace it with a one that costs less. The reason is to keep rate pressure down and to keep rates low.
Great. Thanks, TJ. Well, it is 1:01, so I think I'll turn it back to you if you have any closing remarks. But again, we did capture all the questions, even the ones we couldn't get to. So appreciate everyone's thought on this topic.
Right, and thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jason. I think this was great, a great overview, and we hope that you this was like the next level, deeper dive into renewable energy credits, and it can be very complicated. So if there are follow-up questions, please feel free to ask. As a follow-up from being registered, in the next couple of days, you'll get an email requesting comment on this webinar, what you learned, what was still confusing, what we should address next, what we should think about going forward in the next step of our engagement. You can email, in addition to that email you will get, you can also email the address on the screen here in order to reach out and ask specific other questions. Really, this webinar series has been an initial first step in engaging folks in developing our energy policy. So we're taking what we think is a different approach here. Instead of making the policy and then asking what people think when it has already been fully baked, we're hoping to hear from people as to what's important to them as it relates to electricity first, before making those policy decisions. And these webinars have been the first step in trying to provide information, a common basis of understanding of what the current state of affairs is. We know that today's audience isn't necessarily a representative sample of Vermonters. Actually, we don't know that either way, but we don't, it may not be. The department expects over the spring and early summer to be engaging and continuing to engage in a bunch of different ways. So please look out for this. We're going to be targeting specific community stakeholder engagements, trying to leverage the work of the Climate Council to engage with frontline and disadvantaged communities in particular. We're going to be doing some statewide polling that will be representative of the state's population and demographics, and also some focus groups to really try and get a broader sense of what is important to Vermonters as we make policy. In the summer, we're hoping to take what we've learned and then develop policy summer and maybe into the fall. Because really only after hearing from you all can we really develop a policy that raises up the voices of Vermonters. In the late summer or in the early fall or in the fall, we expect to share what we've come up with and get feedback on whether we've hit the mark or not. All of this is pretty new for us, as I said, and so we hope all of you can continue to engage as we move forward in the process, and we appreciate you understanding as we make mistakes, improve, and better engage with folks to create policy that really meets the needs of Vermonters. And so with that, thank you again. Thank you again to Jason Gifford of Sustainable Energy Advantage for helping us dive into renewable energy certificates. And thank you all for engaging in your great questions. And we will try and follow up to the email list for the questions we couldn't get to. Thank you all. With that, have a great day.